What the Farage time now, and as Border Force predict the number of Channel migrants could double this year to 80,000. Just how did a convicted killer con the Home Office with a bogus asylum claim that saw him go on to murder an aspiring Royal Marine? I mean, this story is just infuriating. So, this is Lauren Green Abdulrahim Zai, who fled Serbia in 2018 after committing a double murder before having an asylum application rejected in Norway. But a year later, the 21-year-old arrived in England on a ferry from France and was allowed to stay after telling officials he was a 14-year-old whose parents were killed by the Taliban. Yesterday, he was found guilty of stabbing 21-year-old Thomas Roberts to death during an argument over an e-scooter in Bournemouth town centre last year. British officials were unaware of his previous convictions, including the 20-year jail sentence he dodged for the Serbia murders. He had also been convicted of drug dealing in Italy, was caught carrying a knife after arriving in England and beat up a man in the street just weeks before he killed Thomas. This is the moment cops arrested the Afghani last year.
Listen, during the early hours of Saturday the 12th of March 2022, an individual in Old Christchurch Road, Bournemouth, was stabbed and subsequently died. Inquiries have established that you have been responsible and therefore you're arrested on suspicion of murder. I've got to caution you, do not have to say anything, but it may harm your defence if you do not mention when questioned something later on in court. Anything you do say may be given in evidence.
Nigel Farage, I mean, this story is upsetting and infuriating. Obviously, the first thing to say is our thoughts are with the family of the victim whose lives have been completely destroyed by this murderer. But it's why you have been warning for such a long time about the people that we are allowing to enter our country illegally. This is the sort of damage that they can wrought.
Legions of young men, Dan, coming into the country. But in his case, clearly, between boarding the ferry in Cherbourg and arriving in the UK, lost his passport. So we can't check who he is. And I was out with Mark White, our Home Affairs editor, last summer out of Dover, and we actually filmed people in a boat crossing into the 12-mile line into British waters. We witnessed them throwing their iPhones into the sea, their passports into the sea, so that nobody can check who they are. Then this guy turns up and says, I'm 14. And we say, oh, you poor little boy, we'll find you a nice foster carer. I mean, oh, we'll put you into school. I mean, the whole thing is a complete and utter joke at that level. But what I've been warning about, Dan, isn't just the fact that now this is an open door for criminals to come into Britain. I've also been warning about national security, that this guy may be a criminal murderer, but who's to say there aren't terrorists among them? And maybe the most worrying thing about this case is that last week, TikTok was absolutely full of Afghans boasting they'd got their right to remain documents. So the way Rishi is going to deal with the backlog is to basically let anyone who comes in and says they're Afghani stay. I have no idea how many more young men like this are coming in. I know that it's a disaster at every level. And I honestly don't believe when Sunak tells the country they're going to stop the boats, I don't believe it's even possible, given British judges and where they sit on all of these issues, if we stay part of the ECHR. I literally don't believe it's possible, because the Human Rights Act of 98 was based upon that convention, a convention written in the late 1940s in the wake of the horrors of the Holocaust, but now not relevant to the modern world in which we live. So my depressing message, Dan, for you and your viewers and listeners tonight is expect much more of this.
No, I completely agree with you about the ECHR. I do. But I think what has been so shocking, Nigel, about the murder of Thomas Roberts is the lack of will from the political establishment, the media establishment, to cover this case and to link it to what is going on politically.
So the Guardian today, I read it cover to cover. I went through it twice. There wasn't a single mention in The Guardian of this case. I listened to the Today programme this morning. It's my morning purgatory. I sort of just put myself through it. It sort of encourages me to go on GBNews and do my best. No mention of it. Yes, mention of other people who've been let out on probation and committed murder, and that's awful. And all crime is awful. All murder is awful. But I didn't hear it on the Today programme either. And it's as if they want to sweep this whole issue under the carpet.
Well, they do, though, don't they? That is literally what they want to do.
Yeah, and literally. And the only reason the Conservatives are even talking about it is because the Red Wall are up in arms, because they voted for Brexit believing they get border controls. And then I'll remind you, the week before the referendum in 2016, I stood before a poster, a breaking point poster, showing a snaking line of young men coming into Eastern Europe. I mean, I was condemned for it. You would have thought I was a 1930s fascist European leader for daring to say it. I believed that Brexit would protect us from idiotic EU policies, and yet it's happening anyway.
No, it is. It is. And they don't want to talk about it, Nigel. And in fact, let's just be honest about this. If you hadn't started talking about this issue in 2019 and 2020, it would have been completely ignored by the political establishment. The only reason they talk about it at all is because you put it on the political agenda and then GB News launched and we have shone a light on the story. I mean, that is a fact.
Yes, and we've broken exclusive after exclusive. Yep. You know, I've been out into the English Channel repeatedly with cameras, filming all this stuff. And it is the realisation that it's mostly young men, some would say young men of fighting age, coming into our country. And I get emails and reports every single day. And some of the things I'm told, I can't even repeat on air. But I'm told of conversations that are overheard or understood from some of these young men and their attitudes towards Western culture, their attitudes towards women in particular, their attitudes towards the advancement of their religion above virtually everything. This is terrifying stuff.
It is, and we will keep on it because it is so important that this murder of Thomas Roberts is not in vain. Nigel Farage, your show was must watch actually earlier tonight. I loved that interview with Polly Toynbee, speaking of The Guardian. So that's worth catching again at midnight. And of course, Nigel back on air at 7 p.m. tomorrow night.